Imagine the dark stillness of a medieval town at midnight. The streets are silent, shutters close tight, and the world seems asleep. But behind heavy wooden doors and glowing ovens, another world awakens. Bakers, those unsung heroes of daily survival, were already at work while the rest of the town dreamed. Their lives were shaped by firelight, flour dust, and the pressure to have bread ready by dawn. In a time when bread wasn't just food, but the very foundation of survival, a baker's nightly labor was essential to every community. In this story, we'll explore the hidden world of medieval bakers, how they toiled through the night, the techniques they used, the strict regulations they lived under, and the unique rhythms of their lives. We'll step inside those warm, smoky bakehouses, follow their midnight routines, and discover how bread, something so ordinary to us today, was once the most powerful symbol of sustenance, economy, and even politics. But before we dive in, if you enjoy falling asleep to stories of history, I invite you to subscribe to History for Sleep. This channel is made for those who love drifting off to the quiet unfolding of the past. Comment below and tell me what times you like to listen, whether it is as you're rewinding down in the evening, or when sleep feels out of reach in the middle of the night. Also, let me know what parts of history fascinate you most. I love shaping these journeys based on your curiosity. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let your mind drift. Tonight, we'll follow the flickering glow of the baker's oven. Listen to the quiet shuffle of footsteps on flour-covered floors, and uncover the secret lives of medieval bakers as they labored through the midnight hours. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we might first think of castles, knights in armor, or crowded marketplaces. Yet behind all of these images lies something much simpler, something that touched every life, whether rich or poor: bread. Bread was more than food. It was sustenance, it was symbolism, and in many ways, it was power itself. In a world without the abundance of modern supermarkets, bread was often the difference between survival and hunger, between peace and unrest. For the medieval person, bread was not a luxury or a side dish. It was the core of the diet. A farmer in the fields, a craftsman in the town, a monk in a monastery, and even a lord in his hall, all depended on bread each day. Some might add cheese, ale, or a bit of meat when fortune allowed, but without bread, the meal felt incomplete. In fact, in many places, bread provided well over half the calories people consumed in a single day. This importance gave bakers a role of extraordinary weight. While they worked in shadows, covered in flour and sweat, their work carried the well-being of entire communities. A poorly baked batch, a shortage of flour, or a dishonest loaf could ripple outward into great tension. For those who lived then, bread was more than nourishment. It was almost a form of currency, a marker of stability, and a mirror reflecting social divisions. The bread of the poor was not the same as the bread of the wealthy. A noble might dine on white wheat bread, soft, finely sieved, and fragrant. It was called manchet in England, or pain de bouche in France, literally bread for the mouth, a delicacy. The peasant, by contrast, ate coarse loaves of rye or barley, often dark, heavy, and dense. In lean years, those loaves might even be mixed with ground beans, peas, or acorns, whatever filler could stretch a meager supply of grain. Yet both loaves, fine and coarse alike, bound society together in their dependence on this humble staple. To understand how vital bread was, we need only look at the records of famine and scarcity. In years of poor harvest, when grain stores ran low, desperation grew quickly. Bread prices soared, and with them came unrest. Entire towns could riot when bakers were accused of raising prices unfairly, or when authorities failed to control supply. The saying, "bread riots," is no exaggeration. Loaves truly could spark chaos. But bread also held a spiritual dimension. In Christianity, which guided much of medieval Europe, bread carried a sacred meaning. At Mass, bread became the body of Christ in the act of communion, uniting faith with sustenance. For monks and nuns, bread was both daily food and a symbol of holy simplicity. This connection added layers of reverence to what might otherwise seem ordinary. The breaking of bread was both a meal and a reminder of divine presence. The importance of bread reached even into law and regulation. Cities closely monitored bakers to ensure that loaves were of fair weight and price. A loaf too light or adulterated with poor flour was not just seen as unfair business, it was considered an offense against the whole community. Laws like the Assize of Bread in England, established in the 13th century, laid down exact rules for how much a loaf should weigh, depending on the current price of wheat. Bakers who cheated could be fined, shamed, or even placed in the pillory before angry crowds. Bread was too important to be left to chance. Consider, too, how bread shaped daily rhythm. The very fact that bakers labored at night was tied to bread's centrality. Families and towns expected bread ready by morning, still warm for breakfast or to carry into fields and workshops. This need for dawn delivery meant that bakers sacrificed their nights to guarantee the survival of others. The act of eating bread in the morning sunlight was the final stage of a cycle that began in midnight hours by firelight. The medieval word for bread itself tells us something about its weight in life. In many languages, bread and life were closely tied. In Old English, the word laugh gave us loaf, and from Hofweird the Loaf Guardian, we derived our modern word lord. In other words, even the very idea of leadership was linked to the protection of bread. To be a lord was to be the keeper of the loaf, the one who ensured that his people did not go hungry. Such was the power of bread in shaping both culture and language. Bread was also a unifier of communities. In many villages, people shared communal ovens, bringing their dough to a central place for baking. These ovens became meeting points, places of exchange, gossip, and kinship. Bread, in this way, was not only the foundation of diet, but of social connection. It tied neighbor to neighbor, family to family, all united in dependence on the same oven's fire. Of course, bread was also a marker of difference. The poor man's dark rye loaf was not only harder to chew, but it also symbolized his social status. Nobles prided themselves on their soft, white loaves, which required better grain and finer milling. To eat white bread was to display wealth. To eat coarse bread was to show the hard reality of survival. And yet, for all these differences, bread remained a shared necessity. Even kings and bishops, for all their power, could not escape their reliance on the baker's craft. If we step back, we can see that medieval life revolved around bread in ways that are easy to forget today. It dictated farming schedules, with grain cultivation as the backbone of agriculture. It shaped markets, with grain and flour forming the most traded goods. It directed law, with governments setting rules to prevent starvation. It inspired faith, symbolized in churches and rituals. And it ordered daily time, setting the rhythm of baking and eating that defined the day. So, as we begin our journey into the hidden world of medieval bakers, we must remember this. Their labor was not small. It was the quiet heartbeat of society, the unseen force that allowed everything else worship, leisure, and even conflict to unfold. Without bread, there was no stability. Without bakers, there was no bread. And so, beneath the flour and the ash, their craft carried a weight far greater than the loaves they shaped. Bread, in the Middle Ages, was not merely food. It was survival, status, spirit, and community all in one. And to truly understand the secret lives of bakers, we must first understand the immense importance of bread itself. To understand the secret lives of medieval bakers, it helps to know where they stood in the layered hierarchy of their world. Society in the Middle Ages was not equal. It was ordered, sometimes rigidly, into ranks of lords and peasants, clergy and craftsmen, merchants and laborers. Within this hierarchy, bakers occupied a curious and important place. They were not noble, but neither were they invisible. They stood in that bustling middle space of craftsmen and tradesmen, respected for their skill, but watched closely for their honesty. Bakers belonged to the world of artisans, those who produced goods with their hands and their knowledge. Like blacksmiths who shaped iron or cobblers who stitched shoes, bakers practiced a trade that was essential for survival. But there was a difference. Shoes could wear thin. Tools could be mended or delayed. Bread, however, was needed every day. This urgency gave bakers both opportunity and responsibility. In towns and cities, bakers were often members of guilds, powerful organizations that governed trades. A baker's guild regulated who could open a shop, what quality of bread must be maintained, and even how prices were to be set. Belonging to a guild gave bakers protection, a sense of brotherhood, and sometimes political influence. It also placed them under scrutiny. Cheating a customer was not just a private act. It was a stain on the reputation of the guild itself. Thus, bakers lived under rules both formal and informal, woven into the fabric of urban life. Among ordinary townsfolk, bakers were figures of trust but also suspicion. Bread was so central to survival that any hint of dishonesty, a loaf too light, too coarse, or too expensive, could ignite anger. There are records of bakers who attempted to add chalk, sand, or ground beans to their flour to stretch supplies. Such practices were condemned harshly when discovered, for they threatened not just taste, but health. People looked to their bakers with hope, but also with watchfulness, knowing their own well-being lay in each day's loaves. Yet, alongside suspicion came respect. A good baker, known for honest measures and steady quality, could achieve a high reputation. Customers returned to them again and again, not only for bread, but for the reliability of their craft. In some towns, families of bakers became established across generations, their names tied to warmth, flour, and firelight. A well-known bakery might become a landmark, a place people pointed out to strangers. There, that is where the best bread is made. It is worth imagining how a baker appeared to neighbors in daily life. By the time others were stirring from their beds, bakers had already put in hours of labor. Flour dust often clung to their clothes and hair, marking them unmistakably. The scent of baking followed them, sweet and smoky, drifting through the air even as they stepped out briefly from the bakehouse. They carried with them an aura of industry and necessity, known for their midnight toil. The baker's standing also differed between rural villages and towns. In villages, the baker was often part of a larger community oven system. Not every household owned its own oven. It was costly, required fuel, and needed maintenance. Instead, a central oven might serve the whole settlement. In such cases, the baker became the guardian of fire, a figure trusted with one of the village's most important resources. Villagers brought their dough, and the baker's knowledge of heat and timing ensured each loaf baked properly. In this way, the baker's work tied closely to community life, and their reputation grew from daily interaction with every neighbor. In towns, however, baking became more commercial. The baker was not just a neighbor, but a tradesman competing with others. His bread sold in stalls, shops, or through apprentices carrying baskets into the streets. In larger markets, bakers could achieve a degree of wealth, some owning multiple ovens or employing teams of apprentices. Here, the baker's social standing could climb higher, edging toward that of merchants. Yet, wealth also meant more attention from authorities. The guild, the city council, and even the church watched bakers to ensure that profit never outweighed fairness. There is also the matter of religion in shaping reputation. Bread was sacred in Christian belief, and bakers were sometimes seen as participating in this sacredness, even if indirectly. To provide bread was to sustain both body and soul. Some bakers were praised for charity, giving loaves to the poor, especially in times of scarcity. Others were accused of greed when they failed to do so. The act of baking was never entirely neutral. It carried a moral weight. We also find stories, scattered in chronicles, of bakers caught in scandal. A baker whose loaves were underweight might be dragged into the marketplace, forced to stand in the pillory while his bread was mocked by townsfolk. Sometimes false loaves were hung around his neck as punishment. These acts of public shame remind us how closely tied a baker's reputation was to the survival of others. One dishonest act could undo years of careful standing. Apprenticeship, too, shaped social perception. To train as a baker was not simply to learn kneading or oven tending, it was to enter into a tradition. A young apprentice was known to the community as one who would someday inherit responsibility. The master baker's reputation extended to his pupils, and the behavior of apprentices reflected back upon him. Families watched carefully the kind of men and women their bakers raised up, for these would be tomorrow's providers. Despite these challenges, a successful baker could enjoy modest prosperity. They might own property, employ helpers, and live more comfortably than unskilled laborers. In wills and documents, we sometimes see bakers leaving behind ovens, tools, and shops to their children, proof of stability. While they were not lords or nobles, their trade gave them resilience, a cushion against the harsher swings of fortune that afflicted peasants. Still, the baker lived in a space of tension. Too poor to claim noble status, yet too vital to be dismissed, they occupied that middle ground where craft and necessity met. Their social standing was both fragile and fragile when scarcity made the people restless, firm when daily bread kept households steady. It is this balance of respect and suspicion that made the baker's life so complex. They were needed, always. They were watched, always. Their flour-dusted hands were symbols of nourishment, but also reminders of the fine line between fairness and deceit. In every town and village, their place was etched deeply into the social order, their ovens burning quietly in the background of medieval life. Thus, the baker's standing was not a simple rank to be measured. It was a living, shifting reputation, shaped by honesty, skill, generosity, and the endless demands of bread. Their place in society was both humble and essential, a position that carried the quiet dignity of survival itself. When the rest of the town slept, tucked beneath heavy woolen blankets and lulled by the quiet of night, the baker's day, or rather, his night, was only just beginning. Midnight was not a time for rest in the bakehouse. It was the hour when the work stirred to life, when ovens were stoked, and when the long, unseen ritual of bread-making began. For bakers, the midnight routine was not simply habit, it was necessity. Bread had to be ready at dawn, when markets opened, when workers and travelers sought food, when households prepared for their daily labors. To achieve this, preparation began while others dreamed. The rhythm was relentless. Flour, water, yeast, salt, fire. Again and again, night after night. The first task was always the oven. Medieval ovens were great domed structures of stone or clay, designed to hold and radiate heat. They did not spring to life instantly. They needed time, sometimes hours of careful tending, before they could reach the right temperature. A baker might rise from his bed while bells tolled for midnight prayers, shuffle across the cool streets to his bakehouse, and begin the slow ritual of fire. Bundles of wood, sometimes logs, sometimes smaller kindling, were fed into the oven's mouth. Flames licked the darkness, sparks rising into the night. The baker would crouch near, his face glowing orange in the flicker, coaxing the fire until the whole chamber blazed. As the oven grew hot, apprentices or family members set about the next stage, preparing the dough. Large sacks of flour, heavy and dusty, were opened and measured. The flour itself carried the story of the harvest-fine wheat if times were good, darker rye, or barley if times were lean. Into great troughs went the flour, mixed with water drawn from wells or carried in buckets. Salt was sprinkled in, precious and carefully measured. Yeast or sourdough starter, kept alive from previous bakes, was stirred through, bringing the promise of rise. The kneading followed, a labor of strength and rhythm. Bakers pressed their hands into the sticky mass, folding and turning, until the dough grew smooth and elastic. In some shops, apprentices performed this work, their arms straining, their clothes powdered white with flour. The sound of kneading filled the bakehouse, soft thuds and stretches, a steady beat against the quiet of the night. It was a bodily task, sweat mingling with flour dust, breath rising in misty clouds in the cool air. By now, the oven's fire had usually done its work. The flames were raked out, leaving behind a glowing bed of embers. The baker tested the heat with his hand, sometimes tossing a pinch of flour onto the oven's floor. If it burned black too quickly, the oven was too hot. If it browned slowly, the temperature was just right. This skill, the judgment of heat, was a mark of experience. Too hot, and the loaves would scorch. Too cool, and they would emerge pale and undercooked. A good baker knew the oven, as one might know a friend, reading its warmth and temper as though it breathed. The shaped loaves, now risen, were slid into the oven with wooden paddles called peels. Each batch was arranged carefully, their placement chosen to ensure even baking. The oven's mouth was sealed, and the silence of waiting began. This waiting was never idle. More dough was prepared for the next round. Flour was measured again, and tools were cleaned. The night was a cycle of movement, no moment wasted, every task aligned toward the dawn. In these hours, the bakehouse was alive with contrasts. Inside, it was warm, smoky, filled with the rich scent of rising bread. Outside, the town lay in deep slumber, streets empty, houses dark. The baker existed in a world apart, straddling the line between night and day. His routine was secretive, not by design, but by nature. Few saw it, fewer still thought of it, and yet all depended on it. The midnight routine was also a time of companionship. Apprentices joked quietly as they kneaded, masters offered gruff instructions, and stories passed in whispers between batches. Some nights were long and weary, tempers short, bodies aching. Other nights carried a strange peace, the steady rhythm of work blending into a kind of meditative flow. The baker's world was one of repetition, but within that repetition lived a sense of quiet brotherhood. There were also small rituals woven into the hours. Some bakers crossed themselves before placing the first loaf in the oven, a prayer for success. Others set aside a piece of dough for the poor, a reminder of charity. In rural villages, women sometimes joined their husbands in the bakehouse, their hands moving with equal skill as they helped shape loaves or prepare trays. In towns, children might be sent to sweep flour or carry wood, learning the family trade almost before they could walk. As the hours passed, the bakehouse filled with finished loaves. Round, golden, crusty, they were stacked in baskets or piled on wooden shelves. The smell thickened, seeping through cracks in the doors, drifting into the streets outside. By the time the first hint of dawn glowed in the eastern sky, the town was already stirring with the scent of bread. Roosters crowed, market stalls opened, workers shouldered tools. And always bread was ready, warm and waiting, thanks to the unseen labor of the night. But the routine did not end at dawn. Delivery began. Journeymen or apprentices carried baskets into streets and alleys, calling out to customers or delivering to households. Families lined up at bakery doors, coins in hand, ready for their morning loaves. The baker himself, weary and flour-streaked, watched his work pass into eager hands. Satisfaction lay not only in the craft, but in the sight of others eating, sustained by the night's labor. Yet the midnight routine also carried burdens. Sleep was scarce and broken. Bakers lived opposite to the rhythm of others, their nights spent in toil, their mornings in exhaustion. The body grew accustomed, but the strain was real. This sacrifice, though seldom spoken of, was part of their standing in society. They gave their nights so that others could have their days. The routine repeated itself with little variation. Each night, the fire was stoked, the dough kneaded, the loaves baked, the bread delivered. It was relentless, yes, but also enduring. Generation after generation of bakers followed this rhythm, their hands repeating the same motions as their fathers and grandfathers before them. In this way, the midnight routine was not only labor but tradition, a timeless dance of flour, water, fire, and will. When we think of medieval bakers, we must picture them in this half-lit world, their lives governed by hours others never saw. Midnight was their morning, firelight their sun, dough their companion, and bread their gift to the waking world. The routine, though hidden, was the very heartbeat of medieval life. Step into a medieval bakehouse in your imagination. It is night outside, the streets silent except for the occasional call of a night bird or the shuffle of someone returning late. The door of the bakehouse is heavy wood, its surface darkened with years of smoke. When it opens, a wave of heat rolls out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of baking bread. Inside is another world entirely bright with firelight, hazy with flour dust, alive with sound and motion, even as the rest of the town sleeps. The heart of the bakehouse was, of course, the oven. These were not the small stoves of later centuries, but great domed structures built of stone or clay, often taller than a man and wide enough to hold dozens of loaves at once. The oven dominated the room, its rounded body glowing faintly from within, the air around it shimmering with heat. The walls were thick, designed to hold warmth for hours, and the mouth of the oven gaped like a cavern, blackened from countless firings. To feed such an oven took skill and effort. Earlier in the night, wood had been piled inside and burned until the chamber roared with flame. By now, the fire had been raked out, leaving behind glowing embers. The floor of the oven was brushed clean with long-handled brooms of wet straw, hissing and crackling as they touched the hot surface. The baker, experienced and watchful, judged the moment when the heat was just right, a balance learned not from books, but from years of practice. Around the oven, the bakehouse was arranged for efficiency. Wooden tables stretched across the room, their surfaces coated in a fine dusting of flour. Great troughs, some carved from single tree trunks, stood ready for mixing dough. Sacks of grain and flour leaned against the walls, carefully stacked, but always shedding a soft powder into the air. Tools hung from hooks, wooden paddles, iron scrapers, sieves, and knives, each with its place in the rhythm of the night. The atmosphere was a blend of contrasts. Heat from the oven pressed against the skin, while the cool stone floors kept the feet grounded. Shadows danced wildly on the walls, cast by flickering flames and swinging lanterns. The air was thick with smells smoky wood, yeasty dough, the rich promise of baking loaves. To step into a bakehouse was to step into a place apart from ordinary time, where fire and flour wove together in a timeless ritual. Apprentices moved quickly about, their sleeves rolled up, hair dusted white with flour. They fetched water, kneaded dough, or carried trays. Their movements were clumsy at times, yet each task they performed had been repeated so often that the rhythm became second nature. Their laughter or quiet chatter filled the pauses between work, softened by the roar of the oven and the steady thump of kneading hands. The master baker stood at the center of this world. He directed with nods or brief words, watching carefully as dough was shaped into rounds or long loaves. His hands bore the marks of years of labor-calloused palms, small burns, flour permanently caught in the creases of skin. Though he may have seemed stern, his craft was his pride, and the bakehouse was his domain. Every loaf carried his reputation. Every mistake could be traced back to his watch. In some bakehouses, wives or daughters shared in the work, their presence shaping the rhythm of the night. They might prepare smaller rolls, cakes, or festival breads. Their hands moved with practiced grace, shaping dough quickly and efficiently, their voices adding to the life of the bakehouse. The family bakery was not only a place of work, but also a place of shared survival, every member contributing to the night's output. It was not always an easy place to be. The air could grow stifling, hot enough to bring sweat dripping down brows and soaking into tunics. Flour dust hung thick, catching in throats, settling on lashes, leaving everyone ghostly pale in the firelight. Burns from hot peels or errant sparks were common. Knees and backs ached from hours of lifting heavy sacks, bending, and kneading. And yet, for all its hardships, the bakehouse was also a place of comfort. The smell of bread, the glow of fire, the closeness of companions, these gave the space a warmth that could not be denied. The bakehouse also carried its own sounds. The scrape of wood against stone as peels slid loaves into the oven. The rhythmic thud of fists against dough. The crackle of fire and the low murmur of conversation. Sometimes silence fell, broken only by the soft ticking of cooling wood. Other times laughter or songs rose, turning labor into fellowship. The bakehouse had its own music, born of necessity, shaped by tradition. Beyond the physical space, the bakehouse was also a place of community importance. Customers might gather at its door in the morning, waiting eagerly for the first loaves. The warmth of the oven sometimes drew neighbors in winter, when the cold was biting and the promise of heat was irresistible. The bakehouse was both workplace and gathering point, a hub of life hidden within the town's night. We must also imagine the smaller details. A wooden ladle resting in a pail of water. A stray cat curled in the corner, hoping for crumbs. A broom propped against the wall, flour clinging to its bristles. Pieces of dough left to rise beneath linen cloths, their surfaces swelling gently with trapped air. These quiet details stitched the scene together, reminders that the bakehouse was not only a place of work, but a place of living moments. Every bakehouse carried the marks of its maker. Some were neat and orderly, tools arranged with care, floors swept even in the busiest hours. Others were chaotic, sacks spilling grain, dough smears left on tables, the air thick with smoke. Yet, whether tidy or cluttered, the purpose was the same: to transform grain and water into the bread that sustained life. To step inside a medieval bakehouse was to witness the very heart of survival. Here, labor and craft fused into something both humble and profound. The oven glowed, the dough rose, the loaves baked, and the town outside waited. Few saw the scene in its fullness, but everyone tasted its result when the sun rose and warm bread filled their hands. The bakehouse was more than just a building. It was a sanctuary of fire, a workshop of nourishment, and a stage upon which the quiet drama of nightly survival unfolded. To those within, it was familiar and ordinary, the rhythm of their lives. To us, looking back, it is a place of mystery and wonder, a glimpse into the secret world where bread was born in the hours of darkness. Behind every master baker, behind every loaf that emerged golden and fragrant from the oven, stood a network of learners and helpers, apprentices and journeymen. Their lives were bound to the bakehouse, their identities shaped by long hours of labor and the slow, steady path of training. If the master was the head of the bakehouse, apprentices and journeymen were its hands and feet, performing the constant tasks that kept the bread flowing. For most, entry into baking began with apprenticeship. A young boy, sometimes as early as 12 years old, might be given over by his parents to a baker's household. From that moment, his life was reshaped. Apprenticeship was not just a job. It was a binding agreement. The boy would live under the roof of the master, obeying his rules, sharing his meals, and serving him faithfully for a set number of years, often 7. In exchange, he would be taught the secrets of the craft, how to knead, how to shape, how to tend the oven, and how to manage the delicate balance of heat and timing that defined a true baker. Life as an apprentice was strict. The master baker was not only a teacher, but also a guardian and disciplinarian. Apprentices were expected to rise when the master rose, to work when he worked, and to bear the brunt of the heaviest tasks. They carried water in buckets from wells, hauled sacks of flour that weighed more than their own bodies, chopped wood for the oven, and scrubbed the floors of the bakehouse until they gleamed. It was exhausting, often thankless work, but it built strength, endurance, and discipline. The learning came gradually, almost invisibly, woven into daily labor. At first, an apprentice might only watch the kneading, standing close to observe the folding and pressing of dough. Later, he would try under the watchful eye of the master, his clumsy hands corrected with sharp words or a guiding nudge. He learned by repetition, shaping loaf after loaf until the motion lived in his muscles. He learned to read dough by touch, to sense when it had been kneaded enough, when it had risen fully, when it was ready for the oven. These lessons could not be written down. They were passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, through years of practice. There was a hierarchy even among apprentices. Older apprentices, nearing the end of their term, often lorded their experience over the younger ones. Tasks were divided accordingly. The newest fetched wood and swept floors, while the more seasoned shaped loaves or managed rising dough. Rivalries could brew in these close quarters, but so, too, could bonds. Many apprentices remembered their years in the bakehouse as both grueling and formative, a time of shared struggle and friendship that shaped them for life. Discipline could be harsh. Masters held authority over their apprentices, much as fathers did over children. Laziness, mistakes, or disrespect could bring punishment, sometimes verbal rebukes, sometimes harsher measures. Records tell of apprentices being beaten for disobedience or fined for negligence. Yet masters also carried responsibility. They were expected to feed, clothe, and house their apprentices, to protect them, and to provide not only training, but moral guidance. A master who abused his apprentices could be called before the guild or the town council, his reputation damaged beyond repair. When an apprentice completed his years of training, he became a journeyman. The term comes from the French journée, meaning day, for a journeyman was paid by the day's work. Journeymen were skilled workers, no longer bound to a single master, but not yet masters themselves. They traveled from shop to shop, offering their labor where it was needed. Learning different styles of baking and saving money for the day, they might open their own bakehouse. The life of a journeyman carried both freedom and uncertainty. Unlike apprentices, they were not tied to one household. They could move to new towns, seek better wages, or find masters who treated them well. But they also carried the instability of temporary work. A journeyman without steady employment could struggle, sleeping in cheap inns or guild lodgings, carrying his few possessions from one bakehouse to another. Journeymen often formed brotherhoods of their own. In some places, they banded together in associations, supporting one another, sharing meals, or pooling resources for those in need. These groups helped journeymen navigate the uncertain years between apprenticeship and mastery, offering companionship and solidarity. For young men far from home, such bonds were invaluable. The transition from journeyman to master was not easy. In many towns, guilds required a journeyman to produce a masterpiece, a demonstration loaf or series of loaves proving his skill. Only if the guild judged his work worthy could he be admitted as a master, granted the right to open his own shop and train apprentices of his own. This test was both practical and symbolic, marking the passage from dependent laborer to independent craftsman. For many, it was the culmination of years of sweat and toil, the reward for countless nights spent in the glow of the oven. The world of apprentices and journeymen was also shaped by the culture of the bakehouse. Stories, jokes, and songs passed between them in the quiet hours. An apprentice might learn not only the craft, but also the traditions and superstitions that surrounded bread. He might be told never to whistle near the oven, lest the loaves fail to rise, or to make the sign of the cross over the dough to guard against evil spirits. These beliefs, passed in whispers, gave the work a sense of mystery and continuity, binding each new generation to those who had come before. We should also remember that not all apprentices and journeymen were male. Though guild records often speak of sons of bakers, many women learned the craft within family bakehouses. Daughters worked alongside fathers, wives alongside husbands, their labor essential, but often less recorded. Some women inherited bakehouses as widows, continuing the work themselves. Apprenticeship for them was less formal, more rooted in family tradition, but no less real. The presence of apprentices and journeymen gave the bakehouse its character. They were the laughter in the background, the sighs of weariness at dawn, the steady hands that kept the work moving. They were the future of the trade, shaped by discipline and endurance, carrying forward the knowledge of bread into the next generation. If the master baker embodied stability, apprentices and journeymen embodied growth and change. They were the living proof that the craft was not static, but always in motion, always preparing new hands to take up the wooden peel and tend the glowing oven. Their lives, though hard, were threads in the fabric of continuity, ensuring that bread, essential, humble, sacred bread, would never cease to be made. Behind every loaf of bread lies a story of ingredients, and behind those ingredients lies a story of struggle. For the medieval baker, bread was not a simple matter of mixing flour and water. It was the result of harvests, trade, weather, and human effort stretching back months, even years. The bakehouse may have been the final stage, but the path to each loaf began far beyond its walls, in the fields, the mills, and the markets. The most important ingredient, of course, was flour. But flour was not one single thing. Its quality depended entirely on the grain available. In times of plenty, wheat was the prize find, pale and yielding loaves that were soft and fragrant. Wheat bread was the food of the wealthy, the nobleman's manchet, or the merchant's table loaf. Yet wheat was costly and delicate to grow. A single poor harvest, a summer of storms, or a winter too harsh, and wheat yields could plummet. In such years, bakers turned to other grains. Rye was common, especially in colder regions. Its loaves were darker, denser, with a sour tang that lingered on the tongue. Barley, too, was widely used, though it produced bread that was heavy and coarse. In many rural villages, bread was made from a mixture of grains, rye, barley, oats, sometimes even blended with beans or peas when supplies ran thin. The result was filling, but it lacked the lightness and taste of wheat. To eat fine white bread was to taste privilege. To eat dark, coarse loaves was to taste necessity. The struggle for ingredients was constant. Grain had to be sown in the right season, tended carefully, and harvested in time. A single storm could flatten fields. A swarm of pests could ruin entire crops. Drought meant withered stalks. Floods meant rotting grain. For farmers, these risks were part of life. For bakers, they were challenges passed down the chain, for no matter how skilled the craftsman, no bread could be made without flour. Even once harvested, grain had to be milled. Watermills and windmills dotted the medieval landscape, their turning wheels grinding grain into flour. Yet milling came at a cost. Lords often claimed rights over mills, demanding fees from peasants and bakers alike. Flour could not simply be made freely. It passed through systems of control and taxation. Bakers had to balance these costs, purchasing flour at prices that shifted with supply, knowing that their own loaves would soon be judged by weight and fairness. Another key ingredient was water. It may seem simple, but clean water was not always easy to find. Wells might run dry in summer, or rivers could be muddied by storms. Bakers needed water not just for dough, but for washing, cooling, and cleaning. A polluted source could taint bread, while a fresh spring could lend purity. Carrying water was also laborious. Apprentices trudged back and forth with heavy buckets, their arms aching before kneading even began. Salt, too, was vital. Without salt, bread tasted flat and if kept poorly. But salt was not always abundant. It was mined or evaporated from seawater, then traded inland at great expense. In some regions, salt was so valuable that it was guarded like treasure. Bakers had to use it sparingly, carefully balancing flavor with cost. In certain areas, bread was baked without salt, leading to distinctive regional loaves, some of which survive even today. Yeast was another ingredient shrouded in both science and superstition. Medieval bakers did not understand yeast in the way we do now, as tiny living organisms. Instead, they worked with what they called leavened sourdough starters, passed down from one batch to the next, or froth skimmed from brewing ale. This living leaven had to be nurtured, kept warm, fed with flour, and protected from spoiling. If a starter failed, the baker faced disaster, for without it, dough would not rise. Some bakers treated their starters almost like family, guarding them as carefully as a treasure. But the struggle for ingredients was not only natural. It was also social and political. Authorities closely monitored the price of grain and flour, for bread was too important to leave unchecked. When grain grew scarce, governments imposed regulations, sometimes forbidding the use of fine flour to ensure supplies lasted longer. Bakers who defied such rules risked harsh penalties. A loaf made with wheat in a time of famine could be seen not as luxury, but as provocation. Famine years tell the starkest stories of struggle. Chronicles speak of desperate mixtures, bread made with acorns, ground ferns, or even straw. These loaves were bitter, sometimes harmful, but hunger drove people to eat what they could. Bakers in such times became both saviors and scapegoats, praised for ingenuity when they stretched supplies, cursed when they seemed to withhold or cheat. Transport also played its role. Grain had to be moved from fields to mills, from mills to markets, from markets to bakehouses. Roads were rough, wagons slow, rivers unpredictable. A storm could halt shipments. A band of robbers could seize supplies. The fragility of this chain meant that the baker's ingredients were always vulnerable. Each loaf carried within it the risks of travel and trade. We should not forget, too, the human struggle behind each ingredient. Farmers bent in fields, reaping grain with aching backs. Millers stood by grinding stones, breathing in clouds of dust. Salt workers toiled in heat or damp, scraping crystals from pans. Brewers skimmed froth, passing their yeasts to neighbors. Every loaf of bread was the product of countless hands, each one adding its labor before the baker even touched the flour. Inside the bakehouse, these struggles were felt keenly. Flour sacks might be lighter than hoped, the grain coarser than expected. Water might be scarce, yeast sluggish, salt too costly. The baker adapted, adjusting recipes, altering methods, coaxing life from what was available. It was a daily negotiation with uncertainty, a balance between craft and circumstance. Yet, despite all these struggles, bread was made. Loaves emerged from ovens golden and fragrant, sustaining towns and villages through good years and bad. The persistence of bakers, their ability to transform imperfect ingredients into nourishment, was itself a triumph. Every loaf was not just food, but victory over the many obstacles that stood between hunger and survival. The story of ingredients is the story of resilience. It reminds us that bread was never guaranteed. Each loaf carried with it the memory of harvests, the risk of storms, the burden of taxes, the labor of farmers, the vigilance of guilds, and the devotion of bakers. To hold a medieval loaf in one's hands was to hold the outcome of countless struggles, bound together in flour and fire. And so, when we picture bakers at their midnight work, we must remember the chain behind them, the fields under the sun, the mills by the rivers, the salt pans by the sea, the ale froth bubbling in casks. The ingredients of bread were not simply bought and mixed. They were fought for, cherished, stretched, and saved. Each loaf was the end of a long journey and the beginning of survival for another day. At the very center of every bakehouse stood the oven. It was not simply a tool. It was the heart of the baker's craft, a glowing furnace of stone and clay that transformed raw dough into the loaves that sustained life. For the medieval baker, mastering the oven was both an art and a necessity. Its heat, its rhythm, and its moods had to be learned intimately, for without it, no amount of skill with flour or kneading would matter. The ovens of the Middle Ages were great, domed chambers, usually built of stone or brick, though in poorer villages they might be made of packed clay. They were often rounded like a beehive, their thick walls designed to hold heat long after the fire itself had burned away. The floor of the oven was flat and smooth, a stage for loaves that would rise and darken beneath the unseen flame. The mouth of the oven yawned wide, sometimes arched with stone, sometimes framed with iron, large enough for a man to reach inside with a long wooden peel. To build such an oven was no small feat. Skilled masons were often called upon, for the shape had to be exact. Too thin, and the oven lost heat too quickly. Too thick, and it took endless wood to warm it. Many ovens were communal, shared by entire villages. Families brought their dough, marked with personal symbols or cuts, so they could be told apart after baking, and the baker or oven keeper arranged them within. These communal ovens were the heart of village life, places where neighbors gathered not only to bake, but also to share news, gossip, and companionship. In towns, bakehouses usually had private ovens. These were larger, designed to handle the volume needed for markets and households. A master baker might own one or two, while the wealthiest bakeries boasted several, glowing day and night. The oven was an investment, a possession as important as the building itself. To lose an oven to collapse or damage was to lose the very livelihood of the baker. The daily tending of the oven was a ritual in itself. The first task each night was to bring it to life. Apprentices carried in armfuls of wood, stacking it inside the chamber until the space was filled. The fire was lit, and soon the oven roared with flame, the walls glowing red with heat. For hours the fire burned, until the stones themselves were soaked with warmth. Then the embers were raked out, often with long iron tools, and the floor was swept clean with brooms of wet straw. The hiss and crackle of water meeting heat filled the bakehouse, leaving behind a smooth, steaming surface ready for loaves. Determining the right temperature was a matter of instinct and practice. There were no dials or gauges to guide the baker, only the senses. A common test was to toss a pinch of flour onto the oven floor. If it burst into flames immediately, the oven was too hot. If it browned gently, the time was right. Some bakers could judge by the color of the stones, others by holding a hand close to the mouth of the oven and feeling the breath of its heat. These judgments were not precise in a scientific sense, but they worked, honed by years of repetition. Once the oven was ready, the loaves were slid inside with wooden paddles, known as peels. These tools, with their long handles and broad, flat blades, were essential. They allowed the baker to reach deep into the oven without stepping into its searing heat. Loaves were arranged carefully, some closer to the mouth, where the temperature was gentler, others deep inside, where the heat was fierce. The baker had to think not only of individual loaves, but of the batch as a whole, orchestrating their placement like pieces in a careful pattern. When the oven was full, its mouth might be closed with a wooden door, or sealed with clay, trapping the heat within. The loaves baked in silence, their crusts forming, their insides swelling, the air filling with a fragrance so rich it seemed to seep into every corner of the street outside. Opening the oven later was a moment of both relief and pride. To see rows of golden, steaming loaves waiting to be drawn out was to witness the success of the night's labor. Ovens were not only for bread. They were sometimes used for pies, pastries, or even roasting meat, though bread was always the priority. In villages, people occasionally used the residual heat after bread baking for their own cooking, sliding in stews or dishes to simmer slowly overnight. The oven, once heated, was a resource too valuable to waste, and communities made use of every degree of its warmth. Yet ovens were also dangerous. Their heat was immense, and careless bakers could suffer burns from sparks or searing stone. Fires were a constant risk. A poorly tended bakehouse could see its flames leap to wooden beams, spreading quickly through the narrow streets of a medieval town. Regulations often required ovens to be built apart from houses, or even outside the town walls, to prevent catastrophic blazes. Despite such precautions, fires caused by bakehouses are recorded in many chronicles, reminders of the fine line between useful heat and destructive flame. The oven also carried symbolic weight. In many cultures, the oven was seen as a place of transformation, where raw, humble dough became nourishing bread. Some people believed spirits might dwell in ovens, requiring respect or ritual gestures before baking. A baker might cross himself before placing loaves inside, or women in villages might whisper charms over dough before it entered the fire. The oven, after all, was a place of mystery, swallowing pale loaves and returning them golden. Over time, ovens became places of identity. A village oven might be the center of its community, the place where families crossed paths, where children played outside while parents waited, where news was exchanged while dough baked. In towns, a bakery's oven was its reputation. The strength of its heat, the consistency of its loaves, the fragrance drifting into the streets, all these things defined how customers thought of the baker. It is easy for us today to overlook the oven, to see it as just another piece of equipment. But for the medieval baker, it was everything. It was the most prized possession, the most carefully tended tool, the most respected part of the bakehouse. Without it, all else fell silent. With it, the rhythm of life continued, night after night, loaf after loaf. And so, when we imagine the medieval bakehouse, we must picture this great domed oven at its heart. Its stones hot, its mouth glowing, its breath filling the room with warmth and promise. Around it, bakers moved like attendants around a sacred flame, their lives bound to its fire. For it was in the oven that the true miracle of baking occurred, the moment when grain, water, and hands became bread, the food of survival. If bread was the staff of life in the Middle Ages, then the bakers who produced it could not be left entirely to their own devices. Bread was too important, too sensitive, and too deeply tied to survival. To ensure that loaves were fair in weight, honest in price, and consistent in quality, medieval society wrapped bakers in a tight web of rules and oversight. Their craft was guided not only by flour and fire, but also by laws, guilds, and regulations that touched every part of their work. At the center of this system, in many towns, were the bakers' guilds. Guilds were organizations of craftsmen, associations that governed trades from weavers to masons, smiths to cobblers. For bakers, guilds offered both protection and control. They gave bakers the right to practice their craft within a town, ensured that outsiders could not simply set up shop without permission, and represented the collective interests of their members. But guilds also bound bakers with strict expectations. Membership came with rules, dues, and obligations that shaped daily life as much as the oven did. One of the guild's most important roles was to regulate training. To become a baker was not as simple as declaring oneself so. A boy would enter as an apprentice, train for years under a master, then work as a journeyman before attempting to qualify as a master himself. The guild ensured that only those who had truly learned the craft could rise to mastery, thus protecting both the reputation of bakers and the quality of bread offered to the public. Guilds also supervised standards of weight and price. Bread was sold not by the loaf, as we think of it today, but by weight. Authorities in many places introduced laws, such as the famous assize of bread and ale in England, which dictated exactly how heavy a loaf should be, depending on the current cost of wheat. When grain was cheap, loaves were expected to be larger. When grain was costly, loaves could be smaller, but always the price to the customer was fixed. Bakers could not simply raise prices as they pleased. Their profit margins rose and fell with the harvest, but their responsibility to the public remained constant. The enforcement of these laws was serious. Officials known as bread weighers or inspectors visited bakehouses to check loaves. They weighed them, sometimes in public, to ensure they met the proper standard. If a loaf was too light, the baker was accused of cheating the customer, and punishment could be harsh. Some towns imposed fines. Others ordered bakers into the pillory to be mocked by the crowd. In extreme cases, dishonest bakers were even banned from the trade. The sight of a baker shamed in public was both warning and spectacle, a reminder of how vital honesty was in this craft. The guilds themselves often reinforced these penalties. A master who broke trust endangered not only himself, but the reputation of his fellows. The guild, in turn, could expel him, strip him of his right to bake, or forbid him from training apprentices. In this way, the guild was both shield and sword, defending bakers from outside competition, while ensuring they did not betray the public trust. But guilds were more than regulators. They also provided community. Members supported one another in times of sickness, offered aid to widows and orphans, and celebrated feast days together. Many guilds had patron saints. Saint Honor in France, for example, became a beloved protector of bakers. On his feast day, guild members might hold processions, offer loaves to the poor, or decorate their bakehouses in his honor. These moments of fellowship softened the harsh edges of regulation, reminding bakers that they belonged to a brotherhood. The close regulation of baking also reflected deeper anxieties about food in medieval society. Unlike today, where variety abounds, medieval diets were precarious. A poor harvest could leave whole towns on the edge of starvation. In such conditions, the fairness of bakers mattered greatly. A loaf too small was not a mere annoyance. It could mean a family going hungry. Authorities watched bakers with suspicion, not because they disliked them, but because they knew how much depended on their honesty. This constant oversight could feel burdensome. Bakers lived with the knowledge that their work might be inspected at any time. A single mistake, a miscalculation of dough, an oven that baked unevenly, a rushed batch could bring accusations of fraud. Many bakers gave vantage loaves or in bread to their customers. Extra portions slipped into the basket to ensure that even if the loaf weighed slightly under, the buyer was not cheated. It was safer to give a little more than risk punishment for giving less. The tension between baker and customer was woven into daily life. Bread buyers, aware of the laws, sometimes weighed their own loaves at home, quick to complain if they found them light. Bakers, for their part, defended themselves with skill, reputation, and caution. The trust between baker and community was delicate, built loaf by loaf, and easily broken. Outside of guild towns and rural villages, regulation was looser but not absent. Lords often controlled the right to bake, requiring peasants to use the manorial oven and charging them fees for its use. This banal oven system placed authority in the hands of landholders, who profited from every loaf baked on their estate. Villagers could not simply bake at home without permission, and those who tried risked fines or confiscation. In such places, the baker's independence was narrower, bound by the rights of the Lord as much as by the expectations of neighbors. Still, even with all these restrictions, baking was a respected trade. The guild seal or the recognition of town authorities gave a baker legitimacy, marking him as someone skilled, trustworthy, and essential. The strict rules that hemmed him in also gave him status, for they showed how important his work was to society at large. Few other trades were watched so carefully, or bound with such complex regulations. When we think of guilds and regulations, we might imagine them as cold or impersonal, a weight on the shoulders of bakers. But to medieval eyes, they offered order in a fragile world. They ensured that loaves were fair, that no man profited from hunger, that customers could trust what they bought each morning. In a time when survival itself often hung by a thread, such protections were not simply bureaucratic, they were lifelines. And so, the baker's life was shaped not only by flour and fire, but by parchment and law. His nights were spent kneading and baking, his days delivering and selling. But behind all this was the constant hum of oversight, the guild's watchful eye, the town council's regulations, the people's expectations. It was a life lived between oven and law, between the warmth of bread and the cold weight of accountability. Yet, for all the strain it caused, this balance endured for centuries. Guilds flourished, regulations multiplied, and bakers adapted. And in the end, the result was simple and profound. Bread that was fair, bread that was honest, bread that people could trust. When the medieval town lay asleep, its streets silent under the cloak of darkness, the baker's world unfolded in a different rhythm. For most people, night was a time of rest. Windows were shuttered, hearths dimmed, animals tucked into their stalls. But for bakers, the night was alive with its own language, sounds, and smells that belonged only to those who worked through the quiet hours, weaving bread into the fabric of the coming day. The first and most constant sound of the night was fire. When ovens were lit, the crackle of burning wood echoed inside bakehouses, sharp and steady. Sparks popped, embers hissed, and logs shifted with low groans as the flames consumed them. It was not the roaring blaze of a bonfire, but a contained, purposeful fire, tended with care. For the baker, this music of wood and flame was as familiar as a lullaby, a signal that the night's work had begun. Alongside the fire came the sounds of labor. Apprentices heaved sacks of flour from storerooms, the coarse fabric scraping against wooden floors. The grain inside shifted with a soft rustle, like sand sliding in an hourglass. Water sloshed in buckets carried from wells, footsteps uneven on cobblestones, the occasional spill splashing onto stone. Inside the bakehouse, troughs creaked as dough was mixed, heavy wood bending under the force of hands pressing, folding, and turning. The steady rhythm of kneading filled the air-soft thuds, quiet sighs, the faint stick of dough pulling away from the table with each fold. The bakehouse was never truly silent. Even in moments of pause, there were the small sounds of life. A cough from an apprentice, the scrape of a peel against stone, the scuff of a shoe against the floor. Sometimes laughter broke the quiet, hushed so as not to wake neighbors, but carrying warmth nonetheless. Other times silence fell heavy, broken only by the faint tick of cooling wood or the whisper of rising dough. Step outside the bakehouse, and the town itself spoke a different language. The streets, usually alive with merchants, animals, and children during the day, were hushed at night. A dog barked in the distance, then quieted. A guard's footsteps echoed as he walked his watch along the wall. The sound of an owl drifted overhead, mingling with the faint rustle of trees beyond the town's edge. To walk through those streets at night was to feel the stillness of a world at rest, punctuated only by the occasional note of life. But even in this stillness, one thing could not be hidden: the smell of baking bread. As ovens filled with loaves, the air changed. First came the faint yeasty scent of dough, earthy and warm. Then, as the loaves baked, the aroma deepened, filling the bakehouse, seeping through cracks in the doors and drifting into the empty streets. The smell of bread had a way of traveling, carried by the night air, curling around corners, finding its way to windows and doorways. For those who stirred in their sleep, it was a familiar comfort. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, stirring awake in the small hours, and catching the faintest trace of baking bread drifting through the shutters. It was a promise of morning, a reminder that food was being prepared, that life would continue. For children, it might have been the scent that lulled them deeper into dreams. For the poor, it could be a bittersweet fragrance, stirring hunger even as it promised nourishment soon to come. The mingling of smells was part of the night's atmosphere. Alongside bread, There was smoke from the ovens, sharp and woody. In towns with multiple bakehouses, these scents layered upon one another, blending into a haze that hovered over the rooftops. On damp nights, the smell clung to the air, heavy and rich. On crisp winter evenings, it drifted sharply, carried quickly along the chill breeze. It was impossible to mistake, impossible to ignore. For travelers arriving late into town, the smell of bread might have been the first greeting, even before they found an inn. For watchmen on the walls, it was the companion to their lonely patrols. For bakers themselves, the scent was both comfort and challenge, the sign of success, but also the ever-present reminder of their responsibility. There were other smells, too, subtle and varied. The flour itself carried a dry, nutty fragrance, filling storerooms and coating the air. Yeast from ale froth lent a sour tang, sharp at first, but mellowing in the mix. Salt, though used sparingly, brought a faint mineral edge. Together, these scents wove into a tapestry that defined the bakehouse as surely as its oven did. The town at night was a world of contrasts. Outside, silence and rest. Inside the bakehouse, warmth and activity. One could walk down a darkened street and pass a door behind which life burned brightly, where heat and motion defied the stillness. The faint glow of fire might leak through cracks, a flicker hinting at the labor within. The sounds and smells marked the bakehouse as a living heart in the sleeping body of the town. In larger towns, where several bakehouses worked through the night, the atmosphere was multiplied. One street might carry the smell of rye loaves, another of fine wheat bread. Journeymen moved quietly with baskets, delivering early loaves to inns or convents before dawn. Cats prowled, drawn by crumbs. Rats, too, lurked in shadows, waiting for a chance to snatch fallen grain. Even in darkness, the ecosystem of the town shifted around the rhythm of the baker's work. There is something deeply human in these nighttime impressions. The sounds of kneading, the smell of bread, the glow of ovens. They remind us that while most slept, others gave their strength to prepare the day ahead. Bakers were not only craftsmen, but keepers of the night, their senses tuned to a world others never fully noticed. To us now, imagining the medieval town at night, it is easy to focus on fear, the danger of darkness, the silence of empty streets. But alongside that silence lived a softer, warmer presence. The bakers' ovens glowed like hidden stars. Their smells drifted like unseen threads. Their sounds whispered of life, continuing through the hours of rest. For those awake enough to notice, the night was not empty. It was alive with bread. When we picture medieval bakers, the mind often conjures an image of flour-dusted men working beside great stone ovens. Yet, to leave the story, there would be to miss half the tale. Women, though less frequently recorded in official documents, played a vital role in the world of bread-making. Their hands shaped loaves, their labor kept bakehouses running, and their presence helped weave baking into the fabric of family and community life. In towns and cities, many bakehouses were run as family businesses. The master baker might be the name listed in guild rolls, but his wife, daughters, and sometimes even widowed sisters shared in the work. A wife might be responsible for preparing dough, managing apprentices, or keeping accounts. She often rose in the same midnight hours as her husband, her presence steady in the bakehouse glow. Where records are silent, we must imagine that countless women who worked without title, their contributions hidden in the shadow of a master's name. The rhythms of baking fit naturally with the rhythms of household labor. Women were accustomed to rising early, tending fires, preparing meals, and caring for children. In bakehouses, these habits extended outward. While apprentices kneaded or fetched wood, women shaped smaller loaves, oversaw proofing, or prepared festival breads flavored with honey, dried fruits, or spices. In some regions, women specialized in rolls, cakes, or sweetened breads, their skill becoming a draw for customers seeking something beyond the daily loaf. Widows, in particular, held a unique place in the baking world. When a master baker died, his widow often inherited the bakehouse. Guilds sometimes allowed widows to continue the business in their husband's stead, especially if they had sons or apprentices to assist. Some widows became well-respected figures in their own right, keeping ovens burning for years after their husband's death. Their names appear in scattered records, reminders that the craft did not belong to men alone. In villages, women's role in bread-making was even more pronounced. Many households prepared their own dough, carried to the communal oven to be baked. Here, women managed the kneading, mixing, and shaping, often passing down knowledge from mother to daughter. The communal oven became a place of gathering for women, an opportunity to exchange news, share advice, and strengthen social bonds while waiting for loaves to bake. The bakehouse, in this setting, was as much a social hub as it was a workplace. We should also consider the physical labor women endured. Flour sacks were heavy, water buckets cumbersome, ovens blistering hot. Yet women took part in all these tasks. Their endurance was often unacknowledged, their strength assumed as part of their duties. In illustrations from medieval manuscripts, we sometimes glimpse women carrying bread in baskets, selling rolls in markets, or standing at tables dusted with flour. These fleeting images confirm what daily life already made clear. Women were integral to the story of bread. The presence of women in baking also shaped the apprenticeship system. Some young girls entered bakehouses to learn the trade, especially if they were daughters of bakers. Though guilds were often reluctant to admit women formally, the reality was that many learned by working alongside family. A daughter's knowledge might never be written into a charter, but it lived in her hands, in the loaves she baked for her household or community. There is also the quieter spiritual side of women's involvement. In monasteries and convents, nuns baked bread for their communities. Their loaves fed fellow sisters, pilgrims, and sometimes the poor at the convent gates. Bread held deep religious symbolism, and the act of baking, it could be seen as both labor and devotion. For these women, kneading dough or tending ovens was not only survival but service, a daily offering to both body and soul. At feast times, women's creativity shone brightly. Special breads for weddings, baptisms, or holy days often required decoration-braided loaves, stamped patterns, or shapes resembling animals or flowers. Women's hands were frequently behind these creations, turning ordinary dough into symbols of joy and blessing. These festive loaves reminded everyone that bread was not only necessity but celebration, linking women's labor to the cycles of life and faith. Despite their importance, women's contributions were often overlooked by official authorities. Guild records, laws, and punishments usually named male bakers. Yet we know from court cases and chronicles that women could be accused of fraud or praised for honesty, just like their husbands. A dishonest loaf sold at a market stall might bring both husband and wife into question. In this sense, women bore responsibility equal to men, even if recognition lagged behind. The daily presence of women in the bakehouse also brought a softer, more domestic character to space. While the oven roared and apprentices strained, the presence of wives, daughters, and sisters connected the bakehouse to the rhythms of home. Children sometimes slept in corners while their parents worked or helped with small tasks like sweeping flour or carrying kindling. The bakehouse, though a workplace, was also a home, and women's presence made it so. In imagining women's role in medieval baking, we must see it as woven through every layer, from the village woman kneading dough by her hearth, to the nun baking loaves in a convent kitchen, to the widow keeping her bakehouse alive, to the wife managing apprentices and shaping loaves through the night. They were not merely helpers. They were bakers in their own right, their skill and endurance vital to every community. Their story is one of quiet persistence. They rarely appear in the bold letters of guild charters, but they appear in the lived reality of bread. Every loaf carried the mark of women's labor, whether shaped by their hands directly or supported by their unseen effort. To speak of bakers in the Middle Ages is to speak of families, and to speak of families is to acknowledge the central role of women. And so, when we picture the secret lives of medieval bakers, we must expand the vision. Not only the flour-dusted men before the oven, but also the women whose hands shaped dough, whose voices filled the bakehouse with quiet conversation, whose presence turned work into continuity. Their story rises gently from the shadows, like dough in the warmth of a fire, reminding us that bread was always the work of many, never the work of one. In the Middle Ages, bread was more than food. It was not simply nourishment for the body. It was woven deeply into the fabric of faith, ritual, and the spiritual imagination. To break bread was to share life itself, and in a world where religion shaped nearly every aspect of existence, bread became one of the most powerful symbols of the sacred. Christianity, the dominant faith across medieval Europe, placed bread at the very heart of its worship. At the Mass, bread became the body of Christ in the ritual of the Eucharist. This belief transformed ordinary loaves into something divine. The wafer, small and round, was lifted by priests with solemn reverence, a sign of Christ's sacrifice and presence. For ordinary people, to receive bread at communion was to be touched by the sacred, to join in the mystery of faith. This spiritual connection meant that bakers did not only feed bellies, they fed souls. Priests depended on bakers to supply pure, fine flour for communion wafers. These had to be made carefully, free from impurities, thin and light. Special bakeries, sometimes within monasteries, were devoted to producing them. The act of baking bread for the altar was seen as a holy task, one that carried immense responsibility. Beyond the church service, bread filled religious life in countless ways. Monasteries and convents, where monks and nuns lived in devotion, were often sustained by bread baked within their own walls. In these communities, bread was both daily sustenance and a symbol of simplicity. Monks might eat coarse loaves of rye or barley as part of their vow of humility, rejecting the finer white bread associated with wealth. The act of eating plain bread became a spiritual discipline, a reminder of Christ's poverty and humanity. Charity, too, often took the form of bread. Monasteries and churches distributed loaves to the poor, especially on feast days or during hard winters. For beggars and travelers, the gift of bread was more than kindness, it was survival. To give bread was to imitate Christ's own giving, the breaking of loaves to feed multitudes. Bakers themselves sometimes donated bread to churches for alms, their work becoming an offering of both faith and charity. Bread also marked the rhythm of religious festivals. On Easter, special loaves were baked, sometimes enriched with eggs, milk, or honey, to celebrate the joy of resurrection. On saints' feast days, bakers shaped breads into crosses, rings, or symbolic patterns. Christmas might bring spiced loaves, fragrant with cinnamon or cloves, their richness marking the holiness of the season. These festive breads were more than treats. They were edible reminders of faith, celebrations of sacred time. In some regions, bread was even used in blessings and rituals. Priests might bless loaves during harvest festivals, thanking God for the year's grain. Bread might be placed on altars, carried in processions, or offered at shrines. In times of sickness, people sometimes ate bread marked with the sign of the cross, believing it carried healing power. Bread was not only a symbol of Christ, it was seen as a vessel of divine protection and blessing. Yet the sacredness of bread also revealed deep tensions. Famine and scarcity often tested the relationship between faith and food. When harvests failed and bread grew scarce, people turned to prayer and processions, seeking divine mercy. Some towns carried loaves through the streets as offerings, begging for rain or relief. The desperation of hunger gave bread an even sharper spiritual edge. Its absence felt not only in stomachs, but in souls. Bakers, caught in this web, carried a kind of moral burden. To cheat in bread making was not only dishonesty, It was, in a sense, sacrilege. Light loaves, false weights, or adulterated flour were seen as offenses against God as well as neighbor. Guild rules and civic laws often framed baking in moral terms, emphasizing fairness, honesty, and charity. Bread was too closely tied to religion to be treated casually. In literature and sermons, bread often appeared as metaphor. Preachers spoke of Christ as the bread of life, the food that sustained beyond the body. Poets used bread to symbolize trust, fellowship, or betrayal, the breaking of bread together as unity, the withholding of bread as cruelty. Even in common speech, phrases about bread carried spiritual weight. To pray for daily bread was to pray not only for food, but for God's continued care. Bread also appeared in more mystical corners of medieval belief. Some people held superstitions that the first loaf baked on certain feast days carried special luck, or that a cross cut into the top of a loaf could ward off evil. To waste bread was seen as sinful, a rejection of God's gift. In every crumb, people found reminders of the sacred order that bound heaven to earth. We must also imagine the sensory connection. The smell of bread rising in a monastery at dawn mingled with the sound of bells calling to prayer. The taste of bread broken at communion was remembered long after Mass ended, a trace of holiness lingering on the tongue. The sight of loaves stacked in church kitchens, ready for almsgiving, was itself a vision of faith made tangible. Bread bridged the gap between spirit and body, the unseen and the seen. And so, bread in the Middle Ages was never only bread. It was sustenance, yes, but also sacrament. It filled the stomach, but it also filled the imagination. Every loaf carried layers of meaning, shaped by centuries of belief and devotion. To eat bread was to be human, but to share bread was to touch the divine. For the medieval baker, this meant his work was never only craft. It was part of a greater spiritual story, a labor that echoed in churches, monasteries, and feast days. His loaves sustained not only workers and lords, but monks, nuns, priests, and pilgrims. His flour was not only food, it was faith, kneaded into dough, baked into loaves, blessed in rituals, and remembered in prayer. Bread and religion were inseparable in the medieval mind. To rise in the morning and eat a loaf was to taste the fruit of God's creation. To kneel in church and receive the host was to taste the mystery of salvation. Between these two realities lay no divide, only the warm, fragrant, golden thread of bread. Behind the glow of ovens and the fragrance of loaves lay another truth about the life of a medieval baker, the toll it took on the body. Baking was not merely craft. It was heavy, relentless labor. Night after night, year after year, the body bent, lifted, breathed, and endured until it bore the unmistakable marks of the trade. To understand the secret lives of bakers, we must also imagine the weight they carried in their muscles, their lungs, and their bones. The first burden was the hours themselves. Bakers rose when others slept, their nights consumed by kneading, stoking, and shaping. This reversal of rhythm wore on the body. Sleep was fragmented, often short, snatched in daylight when the town was noisy and bright. The human body is not built to live in perpetual night, and yet bakers had to adapt. Many grew accustomed, but the weariness never fully left. Eyes grew heavy, limbs sluggish, yet the dough demanded attention. The body learned endurance, but it also learned exhaustion. The physical labor of baking was unceasing. Flour sacks were heavy, sometimes weighing as much as a young child. Apprentices and journeymen hauled them across rooms, up and down steps, their backs straining under the load. Water, too, had to be carried in buckets, each step a careful balance to avoid spilling. To supply the oven, wood was chopped, stacked, and lifted. Every night was a choreography of lifting, bending, and hauling movements that carved themselves into muscles and joints. Then came the kneading. To work dough by hand was to press, fold, and stretch with rhythm and force. Bakers leaned their weight into it, arms straining, shoulders burning, sweat beading across brows. One batch was followed by another, and then another. The repetition built strength, yes, but it also wore joints thin. Wrists ached, elbows stiffened, backs curved under the constant pressure. The art of kneading lived in the body as much as in the mind, a craft of endurance as well as skill. The oven brought its own hazards. Its heat filled the bakehouse, sometimes suffocating, sometimes blistering. Bakers stood near its mouth, their skin flushed, their brows damp, their clothes soaked with sweat. Sparks flew, embers glowed, peels scraped across the stone floor. Burns were coming a hand too close, a slip of wood, a brush against the oven's wall. Scars mapped the hands and arms of bakers, reminders of countless small encounters with fire. Flour itself, though the heart of bread, carried hidden dangers. The fine dust filled the air, clinging to hair, lashes, and lungs. Inhaling flour day after day led to coughing, wheezing, and breath that grew short with age. Some bakers developed what later generations would call baker's lung, a chronic condition from years of breathing powdered grain. To the people of the Middle Ages, it was simply the cost of the trade, one more burden borne quietly in pursuit of bread. Hygiene in the bakehouse was also a struggle. The floor was often coated with flour and ash, the air heavy with heat and dust. Water was precious, used sparingly for washing. Bakers wiped sweat with flour-streaked arms, their clothes stiff from repeated use. Burns could fester if not tended, and infections spread easily in wounds. Life expectancy for many was shortened not by sudden disaster, but by the slow wearing down of the body under constant strain. Yet for all these hardships, the baker's body was also strong. Muscles thickened from lifting and kneading. Endurance grew from long nights of labor. Many bakers were recognized by their build broad-shouldered, sturdy, arms corded with strength. Their work shaped them into figures of resilience, visible proof of the labor required to sustain a community. There were moments, too, when the body found small comforts. The heat of the oven, though harsh in summer, was welcome in the depths of winter. While others shivered in icy streets, bakers worked in warmth, their hands shielded from the biting cold. The smell of bread, familiar and comforting, surrounded them constantly, a sensory reminder of their purpose. The satisfaction of drawing loaves from the oven, golden and perfect, gave meaning to weary limbs and aching lungs. Still, the health of bakers was fragile. Illness or injury could mean ruin. A master unable to work, the oven might see his business falter, his apprentices scatter, his family struggle. Journeymen without strength could not find steady employment. Apprentices unable to keep pace were sometimes dismissed, their futures uncertain. The body was both tool and livelihood, and when it faltered, so too did the baker's place in society. Some bakers turned to remedies for relief. Herbal salves for burns, honey spread on wounds, steam inhaled for coughing. In towns with apothecaries, powders and potions might be purchased, though often at great cost. Monasteries sometimes offered aid, their infirmaries treating bakers alongside peasants and laborers. But more often than not, bakers bore their ailments quietly, continuing to work through pain, for the bread had to be made. Despite the hardships, there was pride in the strength built through baking. The body, though marked by scars and aches, was a testament to endurance. Each burn, each cough, each ache was tied to loaves that fed families, sustained workers, nourished children, and comforted the poor. The baker's health was sacrificed for the health of the community, their bodies worn thin so others could thrive. When we imagine the secret lives of bakers, we must picture not only the glowing ovens and fragrant loaves, but also the weary bodies behind them. The bent backs, the scarred hands, the tired eyes. We must see the quiet heroism in their endurance, the way they bore hardship without pause. night after night, so that morning after morning bread could appear fresh and warm on tables across the town. The story of the baker's body is the story of labor itself, unseen by many, uncelebrated by most, but essential to survival. Their health, their strength, their very breath was poured into bread, shaping loaves with the imprint of their own sacrifice. To eat bread in the Middle Ages was not only to taste grain and fire, it was to taste the labor of human bodies, marked and aged by the relentless work of survival. Bread in the Middle Ages was not merely food for the body. It was also a force that shaped the politics of towns, kingdoms, and even empires. Because bread was the foundation of survival, it became a matter of power, control, and protest. Behind every loaf lay not only the hands of the baker, but also the decisions of rulers, the regulations of councils, and the restless demands of the people. At its most basic level, politics and bread were tied through price. Governments knew that hunger could topple order faster than any enemy army. A town might tolerate high taxes or poor leadership for a time, but if bread grew scarce or costly, unrest boiled quickly. This truth was recognized across Europe, where rulers and councils took active measures to control the price and availability of bread. In England, the Assize of Bread and Ale, first issued in the 13th century, was one of the most famous examples. It fixed the weight of loaves according to the price of wheat, ensuring that the poor could still afford basic bread even when harvests faltered. The law was enforced rigorously, with bakers punished if they sold loaves underweight or overpriced. Similar regulations existed elsewhere, whether in French towns, German cities, or Italian communes, each shaped by the conviction that bread was too important to leave unchecked. But such regulations also placed bakers in a difficult position. When wheat was abundant and cheap, they could produce large loaves with fair ease. But when wheat grew scarce, they were forced to sell smaller loaves for the same fixed price, their profits shrinking painfully. A bad harvest meant not only hunger for peasants, but hardship for bakers too, trapped between the demands of law and the expectations of their customers. Bread also served as a measure of justice and fairness. When loaves were short-weighted or adulterated with fillers, people saw it not simply as bad business, but as betrayal. Riots sometimes erupted against bakers accused of cheating. Markets became battlegrounds of trust, with bread inspectors weighing loaves publicly to reassure buyers. For the people, honest bread was a right. For rulers, ensuring that right was a matter of political survival. The link between bread and politics grew most visible in times of famine. A failed harvest could send grain prices soaring. In such years, towns grew restless, mobs forming outside bakeries or storming granaries in search of food. Chroniclers record scenes of bread riots, where desperate crowds demanded fair prices or seized loaves by force. Bakers, caught in the middle, became both targets of anger and symbols of hope. Their ovens might be guarded by soldiers, their shops shuttered to protect against theft. Even rulers felt the weight of bread. Kings and lords were judged not only by their battles won or taxes levied, but also by their ability to secure food for their people. Chronicles often praised rulers who managed grain stores wisely or opened granaries in times of need. Conversely, rulers who allowed famine to spread or who seemed indifferent to hunger were condemned as failures. Bread, in this sense, became a measure of legitimacy. To provide bread was to rule justly. To fail was to invite rebellion. Religious institutions, too, wielded bread as political power. Monasteries often controlled vast farmlands, their grain feeding not only monks but entire communities. By giving bread to the poor, they strengthened their influence, tying charity to faith. Town councils and guilds also used bread to assert control, regulating its distribution during festivals or crises. To hold the keys to the granary was to hold power over life itself. In cities, bread politics played out daily in markets. Bakers were required to display loaves openly, their size and weight plain for all to see. Officials sometimes marked loaves with seals or stamps, proof of their legitimacy. Shoppers, wary of being cheated, felt empowered by these measures. But such visibility also exposed bakers to scrutiny. A single bad batch could bring fines or humiliation, their reputation quickly ruined. Bread also influenced the wider currents of history. Wars disrupted farming, leading to shortages and hunger. Armies marching across fields left trampled crops, seized supplies, and left famine in their wake. Sieges were often decided by bread, whether a town could hold out with enough loaves to feed its defenders. Chronicles describe people forced to eat bark, roots, or leather when bread failed, their suffering shaping the course of wars and treaties. At times, bread even became a symbol of political protest. Refusals to eat certain loaves could signal defiance. Refusals to sell to certain groups could mark exclusion. In some regions, bakers were accused of hoarding grain to raise prices, a charge that inflamed public anger. Authorities had to tread carefully, ensuring that bakers were seen as servants of the public good rather than as profiteers. The deep connection between bread and politics was also cultural. Proverbs, sermons, and plays spoke of bread as the marker of justice and fairness. To earn one's bread meant honest labor. To steal bread was not only theft, but sin. Kings were sometimes praised as providers of bread, a title that carried more weight than any crown. The very language of survival was political, and bread stood at its center. Bakers themselves often bore the brunt of this political tension. They worked long nights to produce loaves, only to face suspicion from customers, oversight from guilds, and inspection from officials. Their role was paradoxical, humble craftsmen on one hand, yet central figures in the delicate balance of society on the other. In their ovens, the politics of the realm played out quietly, loaf by loaf. Imagine a morning after a poor harvest. The town is hungry, the market restless. A baker opens his shop, sets out his loaves smaller than usual, darker, made with mixed grains to stretch supplies. Customers gather, their voices sharp, their eyes watchful. Officials weigh the bread, murmurs rise, the air thick with tension. Here, in the simple act of selling bread, politics is alive, urgent, fragile, unavoidable. And so, bread in the Middle Ages was never only nourishment. It was law, justice, protest, and power. It could calm a crowd or ignite a riot. It could affirm a ruler's authority or unravel it in an instant. The baker, standing at his oven, was not merely a craftsman, but a participant in this larger drama, his loaves shaping not only the bodies of his neighbors, but the very order of society. Bread and politics, kneaded together, baked together, consumed together. In every crust lay a story of power, in every crumb a glimpse of justice or injustice. To eat bread was to taste not only the harvest, but the politics of the age. The life of a baker in the Middle Ages was shaped not only by flour, ovens, and guilds, but also by place. A baker in a small rural village lived a very different rhythm than one in the crowded streets of a bustling medieval town. Though both produced the same essential food bread, the world around them, the tools at their disposal, and the expectations of their neighbors created two distinct ways of life. To see the contrast is to glimpse the diversity of medieval society itself. In the countryside, the baker was often less of a separate figure and more of a neighbor among neighbors. Villages were small, sometimes only a few dozen families, and bread-making was often a shared responsibility. Many households prepared their own dough, using flour ground at the Lord's mill, and carried it to a communal oven for baking. These banal ovens, as they were sometimes called, belonged to the local lord or manor. Villagers paid a fee to use them, bringing their loaves marked with symbols or cuts to identify them once baked. In this setting, the baker was often the keeper of the oven, overseeing the firing, tending the flames, and ensuring that each family's bread was baked in turn. This communal system made baking deeply social. Women gathered at the oven, exchanging news, offering advice, or simply enjoying one another's company while waiting for loaves to finish. Children played nearby, chasing one another while mothers tended baskets of dough. The oven was not only a place of labor, but also of community, binding the village together through the shared necessity of bread. In some villages, however, there were men or women who specialized in baking, selling loaves to those who could not prepare their own. These rural bakers lived simply, their ovens smaller, their output modest. They were tied closely to the rhythms of the land. A bad harvest meant less flour to buy, fewer loaves to sell, and tighter belts for everyone. Their customers were also their neighbors, and their reputation depended not only on honesty, but on kinship. To cheat in such a setting was unthinkable, for word spread quickly in a village where everyone knew one another's lives. Contrast this with the urban baker, whose world was far larger, more regulated, and often more competitive. In towns and cities, bread was produced on a much greater scale. Instead of a single oven serving a handful of families, bakehouses might employ several apprentices and journeymen, turning out hundreds of loaves each night to feed markets, inns, monasteries, and wealthy households. The urban baker often belonged to a guild, which strictly controlled who could bake, how bread was sold, and what standards had to be met. The guild offered protection against unfair competition, but also bound bakers with rules, inspections, and dues. In this system, the baker was less a neighborly figure and more a professional craftsman, recognized formally within the civic order of the town. Urban bakehouses themselves were more complex than their rural counterparts. Large stone ovens glowed through the night, their fires fed constantly to keep up with demand. Flour was delivered in bulk, often from mills located on rivers outside the city, and apprentices worked in shifts to knead and prepare dough. The atmosphere was busier, louder, and more disciplined, the pace set by the need to meet the appetites of thousands. Markets brought another layer of complexity to the life of the urban baker. Bread was displayed in stalls or sold from baskets carried through the streets. Buyers compared loaves, weighed them, inspected their texture and crust. Competition was fierce, and bakers had to cultivate not only skill but reputation. A single dishonest loaf could ruin trust and drive customers to rival bakehouses. Urban bakers lived under the constant eyes of inspectors, guild leaders, and the townsfolk themselves. The differences extended even to the loaves themselves. In villages, bread was often coarse, made of rye, barley, or mixtures of grains, its purpose primarily to fill the stomach. In towns, wealthier customers demanded finer wheat loaves, white, soft, and fragrant. Bakers who could produce such bread gained prestige, attracting nobles, clergy, and merchants. Urban bread could be a symbol of status, a marker of refinement, while rural bread remained humble, tied to survival. The social standing of bakers also varied between these worlds. The rural baker was simply part of the village fabric, neither much higher nor lower than his neighbors, bound by the same harvests and hardships. The urban baker, however, might rise to modest wealth, his trade giving him influence in guilds and councils. Some urban bakers became prosperous enough to own property, employ many workers, or even supply courts and castles. The city offered opportunities for upward mobility that the countryside rarely allowed. Yet with opportunity came pressure. Urban bakers faced strict regulation, constant inspection, and the risk of riots if bread prices rose too high. In villages, customers were few but familiar, their anger easier to bear. In towns, an angry crowd could smash a bakehouse or drag a baker into the streets. The urban baker lived in a world of higher stakes, where the politics of bread loomed large. Still, both rural and urban bakers shared a bond in their labor. Both rose in the night, both endured the heat of ovens, both carried the marks of flour and fire on their bodies. Whether in a small clay oven in a village or a great domed oven in a town, the craft was the same. Flour, water, yeast, salt, fire, and patience. We should also note how these two worlds overlapped. Rural bakers sometimes traveled to towns to sell surplus loaves at markets. Urban bakers relied on rural farmers to supply the grain they milled and baked. The two lives were linked in a chain of survival, the countryside feeding the city providing markets for the countryside. In imagining these two ways of life, we see how varied the world of bread could be. In one place, a quiet village oven glowed in the darkness. Neighbors gathered around its warmth. In another, a bustling bakehouse filled with apprentices and journeymen labored through the night, producing hundreds of loaves for the dawn market. Both were vital. Both fed their communities. Both remind us that bread was never just food, but the thread that tied together town and country, rich and poor, daily survival and shared humanity. The story of rural and urban bakers is the story of two worlds, distinct yet intertwined. One small, communal, shaped by kinship and necessity. The other large, regulated, driven by competition and ambition. Yet in both, the glow of ovens lit the night. The smell of bread filled the air, and the hands of bakers, whether village wives or guild masters, sustained life itself. While the daily bread of the Middle Ages was often humble coarse rye for peasants, fine wheat for the wealthy, there were times when bread transcended mere necessity. Festivals, feasts, weddings, holy days, and seasons of celebration brought forth loaves that were richer, sweeter, more decorative. These special breads marked the moments when communities lifted their gaze from survival toward joy, weaving flour and fire into symbols of hope, faith, and festivity. For the majority of the year, bread was plain, sustaining but unremarkable. Yet when feast days arrived, bakers and households alike reached for ingredients beyond the ordinary. A wedding might call for loaves enriched with eggs or milk, their softness a sign of abundance. A baptism could be honored with small rolls shaped into rings or plats, each one a token of blessing. At Christmas or Easter, loaves might be flavored with spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves, rare and costly ingredients brought by long-distance trade. To taste such bread was to taste luxury itself, a reminder of the extraordinary within the ordinary. In some regions, honey sweetened festival breads. Sugar, when it appeared in Europe through trade, was reserved for the wealthiest, but honey was more widely available. Mixed into dough, it gave loaves a golden hue and a lingering sweetness. Dried fruits, 2 raisins, figs, or dates found their way into celebratory breads, their sticky richness transforming simple loaves into delicacies. Such ingredients were precious, measured carefully, used sparingly, yet treasured when brought forth for occasions that demanded joy. Shapes carried meaning as well. Bakers and households shaped dough into symbols that echoed the season. Crosses were marked on Easter loaves, circles symbolizing eternity were baked at weddings, and braids or twists adorned loaves for harvest festivals. Some breads were stamped with wooden seals, pressing patterns of flowers, animals, or saints into their crusts. Others were decorated with nuts or seeds, their surfaces shimmering like jewels when pulled from the oven. In this way, bread became not only nourishment but art, a canvas for creativity bound to ritual. Feasts in noble halls demanded especially grand breads. Lords and ladies expected more than simple loaves. Bakers prepared trencher-thick slices of bread used as edible plates, upon which meat and sauces were served. These trenchers absorbed juices during the meal, and though nobles often discarded them afterward, they were not wasted. As soaked bread was given to servants or the poor. Beyond trenchers, nobles enjoyed manchet, bread fine, white, and soft, sieved to remove every coarse particle. Such loaves stood as visible proof of wealth, a contrast to the darker breads of peasants. At times, bread even became part of pageantry. During coronations or great processions, giant loaves were baked, sometimes as large as a wheel, carried through the streets as symbols of abundance. Chronicles speak of kings distributing bread to crowds, each loaf a gift meant to display generosity and bind loyalty. In monasteries, too, feast days were marked by larger or richer loaves, reminding monks and lay people alike that bread was not only survival but celebration. In village life, special breads bound communities together. Harvest festivals often featured loaves baked from the first grain of the season, offered in thanks for the field's abundance. These loaves might be shared among neighbors, eaten with music and dancing, the bread itself a symbol of hope for the year ahead. At Christmas, families might bake small, sweetened rolls, giving them to children as tokens of joy. Easter brought its own traditions, loaves marked with the sign of the cross, reminding all of the faith that bound their days. There were also breads tied to specific superstitions. In some regions, people baked loaves with charms hidden inside, much like later traditions with cakes. Whoever found the charm was said to have good fortune for the year. In other places, bread was baked in shapes meant to ward off evil spirits or bring blessings on a household. A loaf might be carried into a barn to protect animals, or shared at the edge of fields to ensure fertility. Bread, already sacred in daily life, became magical when tied to ritual and belief. Weddings brought especially elaborate breads. In parts of Europe, towering loaves were baked, decorated with flowers, ribbons, or figures molded from dough. These breads were displayed proudly at feasts, then broken and shared among guests as a symbol of unity and blessing for the newly married couple. Some traditions carried forward into later centuries, where wedding cakes evolved from these great celebratory breads. Even in times of hardship, people sought ways to make bread special for celebrations. When wheat was scarce, rye or barley loaves might be flavored with herbs, seeds, or a drizzle of honey. Families saved precious ingredients for feast days, stretching them carefully so that when the time came, bread could still carry the taste of festivity. These moments of sweetness amidst scarcity reveal how deeply bread was tied not only to survival, but to the need for joy. Markets, too, reflected this cycle of celebratory breads. During festivals, bakers displayed special loaves in stalls, their shapes and scents drawing customers. A passerby might buy a small decorated roll to mark the day, even if their purse was thin. Children gazed longingly at loaves dotted with raisins, their eyes wide with delight. Bakers, in turn, took pride in showing their creativity, competing quietly with one another to produce the most beautiful or memorable bread of the season. We can imagine the sensory richness of these occasions. The smell of spiced loaves filling a hall at Christmas, mingling with pine boughs and candle smoke. The sight of golden wedding breads, their braids glistening in firelight, passed from hand to hand. The taste of sweet rolls at Easter, shared after long days of fasting, each bite carrying relief and joy. Bread, so often humble, became extraordinary in these moments, lifting spirits as surely as it filled stomachs. Celebratory breads remind us that medieval life was not only toil and hardship. People longed for beauty, sweetness, and joy, and they found it in the simplest of forms: flour, water, yeast, transformed with care and imagination. In every festival loaf, we glimpse the human desire to mark time, to celebrate love, to honor faith, to share abundance. And so, when we think of bakers in the Middle Ages, we should picture not only the nightly toil of ordinary loaves, but also the moments of creativity and festivity. Bakers' hands shaped breads that were not only food, but symbols of unity at weddings, of faith at Easter, of generosity at harvest. In these loaves, the ordinary craft of baking rose to something extraordinary, nourishing not only the body, but also the heart. The work of a medieval baker did not end when the loaves came from the oven, steaming and golden. The bread still had to reach the people who would eat it. Delivery was as important as kneading or baking, for bread was most valuable when it was fresh, its crust crisp, its interior soft, its warmth still lingering. And so, while most of the town still slept or only just began to stir, bakers turned to the final stage of their nightly labor, the delivery of bread at dawn. In small villages, this delivery was simple, almost intimate. Families who had left their dough at the communal oven returned in the early morning to collect their loaves, still hot from the fire. Women carried baskets lined with cloths, lifting the bread out with practiced hands. Children ran ahead, eager to taste the crust, sometimes breaking off corners before the loaves even cooled. The smell of baking, which had drifted through the village all night, now condensed into warm bundles, carried homeward along dirt paths. Delivery here was not a formal system, but a shared moment of gathering, neighbor greeting neighbor, the oven becoming a place of morning reunion. In towns and cities, however, delivery became a more organized affair. Bakehouses produced far more loaves than a single household could consume. Their bread had to reach inns, taverns, monasteries, hospitals, and households, both rich and poor. Journeymen and apprentices were often tasked with this work. With baskets slung across their shoulders or carried in their arms, they stepped into the cool pre-dawn streets, the weight of the night's labor pressing on their backs. The sight of these bread carriers was one of the first signs of morning in medieval towns. While lanterns still flickered in windows and the streets lay quiet, the figure of a young apprentice, basket burning with loaves, could be seen moving quickly through alleys and marketplaces. His steps echoed on cobblestones, the faint crunch softened by the rustle of straw-lined baskets. The smell of fresh bread wafted outward with every turn, a silent announcement of dawn. Some deliveries were made directly to customers' doors. Wealthier families often arranged for bread to be brought to their kitchens each morning, sparing them the need to visit the market. The household servant would greet the journeyman, exchange coins, and carry the loaves inside, where breakfast fires were just being lit. For these households, bread arrived almost like clockwork, the first necessity of the day already waiting when the family stirred. Other loaves went straight to the markets. Bakers or their assistants set up stalls piled high with bread, from coarse rye loaves for laborers to fine wheat rolls for wealthier buyers. Customers gathered as the sun rose, their hands reaching eagerly for the freshest loaves. The market stalls hummed with chatter, bargaining, and laughter, the still warm bread at the center of the morning's commerce. Delivery also extended to institutions that depended on large quantities of bread. Monasteries, for example, needed daily loaves to feed monks, lay brothers, and the poor at their gates. Hospitals required bread for patients, prisons for inmates, garrisons for soldiers. For such places, bakers prepared bulk deliveries, their baskets heavy, their arms aching as they carried bread through winding streets. In these moments, the baker as work revealed its full significance. Bread was not only food for individuals, but sustenance for entire communities. We can imagine the rhythm of these dawn deliveries. The clatter of wooden doors opening as apprentices knocked, the murmur of exchanges at thresholds, the rustle of cloths drawn back to reveal steaming loaves. The market squares filling slowly with the sounds of trade, punctuated by the calls of sellers advertising their bread. Fresh loaves, warm from the oven. A cry repeated in dozens of voices, each one vying for attention, each one bearing the weight of the night's labor. Delivery carried risks as well. Baskets were heavy, streets uneven, and loaves could be damaged in the jostle of movement. Apprentices had to be careful, balancing their loads, protecting bread from falling or from the reach of stray dogs and curious children. In winter, icy cobblestones made the task treacherous. In rain, baskets had to be covered to protect loaves from damp. A clumsy fall could ruin hours of labor, so apprentices learned quickly the art of careful carrying. For bakers, the moment of delivery brought both relief and vulnerability. Relief because the night's work was done, and the loaves had found their way into the hands of those who needed them. Vulnerability, because this was the moment when the public judged their craft. A loaf too small, too coarse, too pale customers would notice immediately. Delivery was not only about transport, but about reputation, each loaf carrying the baker's name and skill into the world. There was also pride in this stage of the work. To see people tearing pieces of warm bread, to hear the crunch of crust and the sigh of satisfaction, was the baker's reward. The loaves were no longer hidden in the bakehouse, but alive in the mouths and bellies of neighbors. Children ran with crumbs on their faces. Workers carried bread into fields and workshops. Priests ate loaves alongside morning prayers. The baker's unseen labor was suddenly everywhere, woven into the rising day. In some places, delivery itself became ceremonial. On feast days, bakers donated loaves to churches, distributing them among the poor after Mass. Loaves were stacked on altars, blessed by priests, then shared in charity. At weddings, special breads were delivered to households of both families, tokens of celebration carried through the streets. Even in times of famine, the delivery of bread, whether from baker, lord, or monastery, was a moment of drama, watched eagerly by hungry crowds. Night delivery also created a world of fleeting encounters. Apprentices passed guards on their rounds, exchanged greetings with milk sellers or fishermen, preparing their own early work. These figures of the night and dawn recognized one another, forming a quiet brotherhood of laborers whose lives unfolded in the hours before most people awoke. The town, in these moments, belonged to them, its silence broken only by the shuffle of their steps and the murmur of their tasks. For the baker himself, the delivery marked the end of his long vigil. As the first rays of sunlight touched rooftops, he could rest at last, his ovens cooling behind him, his shop stocked for the day. The loaves had left his hands, carried outward to homes, markets, and tables. His body, weary and dusted with flour, could finally lie down, even as the rest of the town rose to begin its day. The cycle of midnight delivery reminds us that bread was not just about baking, but about sharing. It was the bridge between the hidden labor of the night and the visible life of the day. Without delivery, bread remained unseen, its value unrealized. With it, the baker's work entered the world, nourishing not only stomachs, but the daily rhythm of society itself. And so, when we imagine the secret lives of medieval bakers, we must not forget these dawn figures, the apprentices carrying heavy baskets, the journeymen calling out in the streets, the bakers watching as their loaves were handed over with coins or blessings. It was in these quiet, early hours, as the sky lightened and the smell of bread filled the air, that the connection between baker and community was fully realized. Bread was born at midnight, but it lived at dawn. Bread, though ordinary and daily, carried a sense of mystery in the Middle Ages. To watch a lump of dough swell and rise, to see it transformed in the oven into golden loaves, felt almost magical. The baker, who guided this process night after night, lived close to forces that were not fully understood: yeast, fire, heat, and time. Out of this closeness grew stories, myths, and superstitions. These tales, whispered in bakehouses and passed down through generations, reveal the deeper imagination that surrounded the baker's craft. One of the most enduring beliefs concerned the rising of dough. Medieval people did not know about yeast as tiny living organisms. Instead, they explained rising with mystery and spirit. Some thought it was the breath of God that filled the dough with air, a small miracle repeated each night. Others believed spirits or fairies might interfere with the rising, and so bakers made protective gestures, crossing the dough with their fingers, muttering prayers, or even striking the trough lightly 3 times before leaving it to ferment. These actions were not only habits of faith, but shields against unseen forces that might spoil the bread. Fire, too, was surrounded by superstition. The oven's heat was unpredictable, sometimes scorching, sometimes fading too soon. Bakers treated fire with reverence, almost as if it had a will of its own. Some whispered charms when lighting the oven, calling for steady flames. Others believed that if sparks flew too high, it foretold trouble, perhaps even a coming famine. To spill water on a fire accidentally was thought unlucky, a sign that loaves would fail. In this way, the daily management of ovens carried with it a world of meaning far beyond practicality. There were also superstitions about the bread itself. Cutting a loaf before it had fully cooled was said to bring bad luck. Dropping a loaf on the floor was considered an insult to God's gift of grain. Some households placed a small cross in the bottom of the bread trough, a mark of blessing for every batch kneaded within. In certain villages, the first loaf of a new harvest was never eaten casually. It was shared at the church altar or among neighbors to honor the sacred cycle of seasons. Stories of dishonest bakers also filled the imagination. In many towns, tales were told of bakers who cheated customers by making loaves too light or mixing flour with chalk or sand. Such men were often caught and punished, but the memory of their deceit lived on in warnings and fables. In England, the custom of giving a baker as dozen, 13 loaves when 12 were ordered, grew partly from this fear of punishment. By giving extra, bakers protected themselves against accusations of short measure. Over time, the story of the baker's dozen became legend, a reminder of both caution and generosity. Fables also cast bakers as characters. In some folk tales, bakers were praised for their honesty, feeding the poor or giving bread to travelers in disguise, who turned out to be saints or angels. In other stories, bakers were punished for greed, their loaves turning to stone or their ovens going cold until they repented. These tales reminded communities that bread was not just business, but moral duty, a reflection of fairness and charity. Superstitions also touched delivery. Some believed that if a loaf cracked loudly in the oven, it foretold a quarrel in the household that would eat it. If the crust split evenly, it was a sign of peace. Loaves given as gifts were often marked with symbols, crosses, stars, or initials to guard against envy or misfortune. To refuse bread offered in goodwill was considered an insult, almost an act of hostility, for bread carried not only nourishment but blessing. The figure of the baker even appeared in medieval plays and songs. In mystery plays performed during festivals, bakers were sometimes portrayed as comic characters, flour-dusted and harried, their endless kneading exaggerated for laughter. But beneath the humor lay recognition of their importance. To joke about bakers was to acknowledge their constant presence in daily life, their ovens burning even when all else was dark. Seasonal superstitions were common as well. During harvest festivals, people sometimes baked loaves shaped like sheaves of grain or animals, believing these forms would protect the next year's crops. On New Year's, a loaf might be given to neighbors as a charm for good fortune. In some regions, a small piece of bread was tucked into a child's cradle to ward off illness, or carried by travelers as protection on long journeys. These customs blurred the line between food and talisman, showing how bread embodied both survival and spirit. We should also remember the darker side of superstition. In times of famine, when bread failed, people sometimes searched for scapegoats. Bakers, with their hidden ovens and secretive night work, could be accused of hoarding grain or practicing sorcery. There are records of bakers dragged before councils, accused of using witchcraft to spoil flour or make loaves rise unnaturally. Such accusations reveal the fear that clung to bread making, the sense that something mysterious and potentially dangerous dwelt within the process of turning grain to loaf. Yet for most, the myths and superstitions of baking were not sinister but comforting. They offered explanations for mysteries, rituals for protection, and stories to pass through long nights of labor. An apprentice kneading dough might whisper a charm, not because he believed fully in spirits, but because it connected him to generations before him who had done the same. A baker crossing a loaf before sliding it into the oven carried forward a tradition of faith and blessing. These small acts linked work to meaning, turning craft into something larger than itself. Even today, echoes of these superstitions linger. People still speak of the baker's dozen. Families still mark loaves with crosses at Easter. The sense of bread as more than food, as symbol and story, has never entirely disappeared. It reminds us that the medieval world was not only practical but imaginative, seeing wonder in the everyday and mystery in the ordinary. The stories, myths, and superstitions of bakers add another layer to their secret lives. They show us how people understood the unseen forces of their world, how they bound faith, fear, and hope into the very loaves they ate. For the medieval baker, every loaf carried not just flour and water, but meaning, blessings whispered, warnings remembered, stories retold. To eat bread was to consume not only sustenance, but also the imagination of a people, kneaded into dough, baked into crust, and shared at tables across generations. For centuries, the world of the medieval baker was one of continuity. Night after night, the oven was stoked, the dough kneaded, the loaves delivered. The tools changed little, the rhythms remained steady, and the need for bread never ceased. Yet even in the Middle Ages, change was quietly unfolding. Across the centuries, new ingredients appeared, new towns grew, new technologies emerged, and the role of the baker began to shift. By the close of the medieval period, baking looked both familiar and subtly different, a bridge between old traditions and the world to come. One of the greatest forces of change was urban growth. In the early Middle Ages, much of Europe was rural, dotted with small villages where communal ovens bound communities together. But as towns expanded and cities swelled, the demand for bread multiplied. Urban bakeries became larger, more organized, more professional. The humble village oven gave way to busy bakehouses, employing teams of apprentices and journeymen, producing hundreds of loaves for markets, monasteries, and noble households. With growth came regulation. Guilds, which had existed in earlier centuries, grew more powerful and more structured. They carefully controlled who could bake, how bread was sold, and what prices were charged. For bakers, this meant both security and restriction. They were shielded from too much competition, but they also lived under constant inspection. The life of a baker became increasingly formalized, a recognized trade woven into the civic order of the town. Ingredients, too, began to change. Wheat, once a luxury for the wealthy, became more available as agriculture improved. New methods of crop rotation, better plows, and expanded farmland brought larger harvests. Townsfolk increasingly demanded fine white bread, a taste of refinement that marked their prosperity. While rye and barley remained staples for the poor, the growing presence of wheat loaves reflected a subtle shift in society's expectations. The spice trade also transformed baking. From the east came cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, carried along long trade routes into European markets. These spices were expensive, beyond the reach of most, but they appeared in special breads for the wealthy. A loaf flavored with cinnamon or studded with raisins was no longer just food. It was a statement of status, a taste of the faraway world brought into the hearth. The baker's role expanded from provider of sustenance to creator of delicacies, blending the ordinary with the exotic. Technological change also touched the baker's world. Mills grew more efficient, powered by water and wind, their great wheels turning grain into flour on a scale unimaginable in earlier centuries. The availability of flour increased, though lords and town councils still controlled its price. Ovens, too, were refined, built sturdier, larger, more consistent in their heat. While the basic principle of the domed oven remained unchanged, its construction became more specialized, its performance more reliable. Even the understanding of yeast slowly shifted. Though medieval bakers did not yet know of microorganisms, they became increasingly skilled in cultivating leaven, preserving sourdough starters, or using brewer's yeast with precision. Baking became more consistent, less dependent on guesswork, though mystery still lingered in the rising of dough. These small improvements built gradually, making the baker's work more reliable and his loaves more predictable. Socially, the baker's place continued to evolve. In villages, he remained a neighbor among neighbors, tied to the same harvests and hardships. In cities, however, bakers gained a measure of prosperity. Some became wealthy, owning property, employing many workers, and wielding influence within guilds. Their names appeared in civic records, their shops recognized landmarks in the urban landscape. Baking, once humble, could now be a path to respectability, even modest power. Yet the baker's role was still precarious. Bread remained deeply political, its price watched carefully by rulers and townsfolk alike. Riots still flared when loaves grew scarce. Accusations of dishonesty or profiteering could destroy reputations overnight. The baker lived always between respect and suspicion, a figure essential to survival, yet vulnerable to blame. This tension endured, even as the world around him shifted. The religious meaning of bread, too, persisted but also adapted. The Eucharist remained central, but festive breads multiplied, tied to local customs and seasonal rituals. Bakers supplied monasteries with both humble loaves and celebratory ones, their work bridging daily hunger and sacred devotion. As Christianity expanded across Europe, so too did the traditions of bread, each region shaping them with its own flavors and symbols. By the late Middle Ages, baking had become more diverse than ever before. In cities like Paris, London, or Florence, bakeries offered an array of loaves, coarse rye for laborers, fine manchet for nobles, spiced festival breads for holidays, trenchers for feasts. Street vendors carried rolls and small cakes through crowded alleys, their cries mingling with the sounds of markets. Bread was no longer a single thing, but a spectrum reflecting class, occasion, and taste. The baker's midnight labor, however, remained unchanged. Even as towns grew and ovens improved, the cycle continued. Wood fed into flames, flour turned to dough, loaves drawn out at dawn. The secret lives of bakers still unfolded in darkness, their craft still hidden from most eyes. The world might be changing, but the rhythm of bread endured. Looking back, we see in this period the seeds of the future. The growth of cities, the rise of guilds, the expansion of trade, the refinement of taste, all these changes would carry baking into the modern world. Yet at the same time, much remained timeless. The feel of dough beneath hands, the glow of ovens in the night, the satisfaction of loaves delivered at dawn, all these things tied the late medieval baker to his earliest ancestors, and even to bakers of today. The changing world of baking reminds us that history is both continuity and transformation. The medieval baker stood at the crossroads of both. He inherited traditions from centuries past, carried them forward through nightly labor, and passed them on slightly altered, slightly enriched to the generations that followed. His world shifted slowly, but always around the same enduring truth, that bread was life, and those who baked it carried the weight of survival for all. And so, our journey through the secret lives of medieval bakers comes to a close. We have walked with them through quiet streets at midnight, felt the warmth of their ovens, smelled the fragrance of loaves rising in the dark, and seen how their work touched every corner of society. Bread was not only food, but survival, faith, politics, and celebration. And at the center of it all were the bakers humble, weary, yet steadfast, whose hidden labor made life itself possible. Though their names are mostly lost to history, their legacy endures in every loaf we break today. The rhythms they followed, kneading, shaping, tending fire, delivering at dawn, are the same rhythms that sustain us still. Their lives remind us that history is not only kings, battles, or monuments, but also the quiet work of ordinary people, carried out faithfully, night after night. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can imagine those medieval streets again, the silence of the night, the glow of firelight behind a wooden door, the smell of bread floating through the cool air. The bakers are there, working in shadows, their hands shaping the dawn. Their world is far away, yet in many ways it is still with us. Thank you for joining me on this long, gentle journey. If you enjoyed this story and would like more history to fall asleep to, I invite you to subscribe to History for Sleep. Share in the comments what times you listen, whether it's as you settle into bed at night or when you need a quiet companion in the middle of a restless hour. And let me know what parts of history you'd like to wander through next. I love hearing your ideas. For now, rest easy. Let the stories of the past carry you into dreams, calm and unhurried, as the baker's ovens once carried warmth into the dawn.